Hello and welcome to Whole Lot. I am Zach.
I am also Zach.
Yeah, that's right. It's back-to-back Zack and Zach.
Again.
Yes, yet again. So about what we're going through today, it's going to be pulling the perfect shot. It's really going to be a discussion on kind of fine-tuning for flavor and all the things that really have to do with flavor and espresso. And just a warning, a heads up, it does get pretty advanced today.
Yeah, we were here last week, the two of us together, talking about kind of basics of dialing in and getting your setup ready to go. But we're going to kind of get really in-depth with some of the really nitty-gritty stuff. So it is going to be a little bit in-depth. Just stick with us. If you don't have something already, this would be a great time while we're getting settled in. Make yourself a shot, get yourself a drink. We're going to be going over a couple things today, right?
Oh yeah. So about today's structure, a little bit about what we're going to go through is your equipment needs, first off. Yep. So everything that you need to kind of follow along with us today, which we highly suggest. Then we're going to go through our burr choices. That's right. We're going to go through coffee grinders and burrs and how that affects taste today. Mm-hmm. Then we're going to go through temperature, then flow. Then we're going to prove ourselves with a little coffee algebra. So everything that we're doing today will then put numbers to the test at the end of today. So don't worry about having a TDS or any of those things at home. If you do, I mean, that's really cool, but it's not necessary. And if you have any questions throughout this process, we'll be having a couple little Q&As here and there between our rants, which might get a little long today. So
try to keep you on track today. But yeah, throw questions into the chat and we'll get to them kind of as we go through our different topics. And then we're going to take a couple minutes at the end to take a little bit lengthy, in-depth question and answer session. 4 questions, just throw them into the chat. We are recording today, so just be aware of that. If you're not, if you're not comfortable with your question being asked or answered, maybe just give us a call or an email. Use our chat thing, talk to one of us or another Zach if you have questions or need any further help with whatever we're talking about today.
Exactly. Well, with that, I guess we should talk about what's everything we need for today. So, awesome. So
obviously, we're going to need an espresso machine and a grinder to grind our coffee with. We're using, again, the Profitec Drive has been great for us on these streams. Newer machine from Profitec. We're going to be using mostly the Atom W75, one of the new weight-based grinders from Eureka. And then we just have our kind of normal accessories for your good puck preparation, tampers, distributors, dosing funnels and stuff like that to keep things clean and neat, tamping station to protect your countertop and everything like that. But we also have a couple of kind of specialty tools that we're using today, right?
Yeah, so on my nerdier side of things, I would say, I mean, that's pretty nerdy on that side, but over here, right off the bat today, we're going to be using this dye fluid particle analyzer. So this is how I'm going to really kind of show why this particle distribution, which we'll get into details shortly, really matters. And then also I have the dye fluid TDS reader here, and a couple little tools that I'll have to use. We're also going to be using a scale for everything we do today.
So what does the TDS monitor look for, on a very basic level?
So basically that's looking at your total dissolved solids. So basically a ratio between your water and coffee. And that'll kind of tell us a lot of what is actually extracted from our coffee.
Yeah, basically telling us how much coffee is in the coffee.
Yes, and the main component of how we change that actually depends on your grind size. So this is where burrs come in great importance because that's mainly what's going to be changing a lot of our extraction and what we'll get in that TDS at the end. So if we sum it up on what is happening during an espresso extraction, we're looking at a lot of pressure and heat. So you might be used to maybe a filter process, and during the filter process, that's actually causing something called diffusion. Now, diffusion is very different from what we're doing in espresso, and that typically requires, a filter method, and this slowly dissolves all of our grind sizes. So if we think about a bed of grinds, it's slowly dissolving it, and we can actually get pretty well into that grind bed as well. Where on the other hand, we're starting to deal with something called erosion. So how our coffee is eroding away with heat and pressure in espresso.
Yeah, basically how those individual grinds, those individual particles in the coffee puck are actually like breaking down and essentially falling apart as we're pushing hot water and amounts of pressure through them. Yeah.
And we like to think of this as kind of washing away the surface. So we're really focused on surface area when it comes to espresso, since we're just washing off the surface and we're not dissolving anything. We don't have that time to dissolve because, with time, that's more of a diffusion, and less time is more of relying on that erosion, washing off the surface, kind of like washing off our clothes.
Right,
so,
yeah.
It would taste way better in this case. But so as we're actually grinding, your coffee is going to break down into several different fragments. So understanding the fragments of what we're breaking down is going to be important for extraction. So as we break it down, this is called grind size distribution, all these different sizes. Right. So first off, we're going to start off with fines. Yeah. So as we have fines, we can kind of think of like the exit velocity of a lot of these burrs. If we can go ahead and get a close-up of a lot of these burrs over here, I have a couple different examples here. So fines occur when a bunch of beans actually get trapped within our burrs, and they'll keep breaking down before finally exiting our burrs. So when they finally exit, they're kind of at the smallest point that they possibly are. Right. Now, grind sizes that exit first are also called boulders.
Right. And those are going to be on the bigger side of your grind. The things that are exiting first, not spending so much time in between the burrs and getting, connected with multiple times, maybe just a few as compared to others. So within our grind size, while we do prefer consistency, there's always going to be some variation between the individual particles, and basically a difference that's only going to be noticeable like under a microscope or a particle analyzer, but they do make a huge difference in how our actual extraction is coming out.
Exactly. So the bulk of what we're doing and the high percentage of what we're doing, we do have what is called a micron size of what we're really aiming for. We want an average micron size when we're trying to dial in this espresso, and also have a nice even bed that's going to extract well. But we need both of these kind of like on the side of boulders and on the side of fines. Right. And if we were to actually describe this further, we can actually go ahead and take a little bit of a particle analysis test so I can describe the sizes of these particles.
Yeah, so on the left I have some of the grinds from our Varia VS3 grinder, and then on the right was some from the Atom W75. These are both similarly dialed in for espresso, should be a roughly, equal grind size on each of them coming from each grinder. Let's see what we're actually the real nitty-gritty science of the size of our particles is going to come up on the difluid particle analyzer.
All right, so we're going to take a test from this right side, kind of shakes the bed. And then we'll be able to see that kind of ideal grind size as an average. So on average, we have a fine grind. Now, we're looking at about 499 on our actual average of that micron size. Microns are the size unit that we're going to be using throughout when we're talking about grinds today. And as you can see, 50% of our grind size is actually contributed to fines. But even with 50%, this only contributes to about 10% of our volume. Right. But 50% of our extraction is actually contributed to our overall fines.
So basically what that's saying is that there's a very, very small amount of our total coffee in our puck is going to be of that very fine size, the fines, but most of the actual, because it has more surface area to it, we're getting actually most of our extraction from the finer parts of it, and less so from the larger, the boulders and just the medium kind of in between particles of our grind.
So if we were to actually look at our grind size distribution here, we can actually see that anything under this 300 microns is what I would consider into that fines range. Now, this has a lot to do with our overall extraction. Right. So these are more soluble and easily extracted, almost immediately extracted, and actually contribute with that for that 50% of our overall extraction. Where boulders, we would consider, a little bit more towards that 600 especially these 850s, anything on this side, those would be considered boulders. And while our average, kind of right in between here, these would be considered that particle distribution that we're kind of shooting for, that average, in order for us to kind of dial in. But we want to look at the whole entire distribution, and that'll tell us a lot about our flavor profiles as well.
Yeah, and ideally, like a good consistent grinder, the kind of graph that we're looking at of the particle size is going to come out like roughly similar to that every time, but it's always going to be noticed, it's always going to be true that most of our extraction is coming from the finer parts of the grind just due to that surface area. That comes down to the differences between burrs, right? So if we're using different burrs, we're going to get different we're going to get different percentages of fines or boulders like compared to different burrs.
Exactly, and that all depends on the size and shape, really.
Right.
So if we look at our burrs here, so we actually see that within fines and all coffee extractions, the actual extraction happens on the surface of coffee grinds. So if it happens on the surface, we actually want to either increase or decrease our surface area. So as we're increasing our surface area, you start getting more of the fines. As we decrease, you get more of those boulders. So keep that in mind as we're going forward and talking about these burrs. So if we want to get back into the burrs here, we're going to look at two different kinds here. So we have conical shape, and then we also have flat shape burrs. Now, one of these actually produces more fines than the other, and that would actually be conical. And that's just the way that those beans actually get trapped within here and the rate of which it exits.
Yeah, they're a little bit more likely to just be caught in there longer. Like there's a little bit less area compared to like the whole cutting surface of the burrs for them to be released. So you're always going to get a little bit more fines when using a conical burr grinder as opposed to a flat burr grinder.
So in that sense, we can probably get a little bit more of a body from this or a higher extraction from conicals on average. But with that said, there's lots of designs of conical burrs that more simulate extractions and fine percentages of flat burrs as well. So with that, we might find a little bit more of an even grind size with something that is flat. These are considered flat burrs. They would just kind of come together like so. And that has to do with the amount of surface area of which we are cutting.
Right.
So one thing that happens within conical shape is that it does rely on a lot of crushing. And when we start crushing our beans, kind of naturally, our beans are very brittle, so they're going to break apart into multiple different fragments during that process.
Yeah.
So that process can be kind of detrimental if we're trying to keep a well-defined distribution, whereas we are cutting with our flat burrs.
Right. Just kind of like the way to consider that is if I was to take a knife to try and cut like a watermelon in my kitchen, I'm going to have a much easier time to cut it in half. Now, if you give me a sledgehammer to try to cut that watermelon in half, it's going to be a little less predictable on how many pieces I'm going to get out of that and what size they're going to be.
A little bit difficult to eat from there. So.
Yeah.
So when we're actually considering the actual restraints of these burrs, I mean, there's no way to really go wrong. You can really get a great extraction no matter what we're doing. It really kind of depends on that exit velocity and like how fast things are exiting out of those burrs. And we can kind of contribute exit velocity and what's happening to those fines and boulders depending on three different things, right?
Well, that does kind of also beg the question too, before we get too into that, like, is there a one that's better than the other between a conical or a burr grinder, right?
Yeah.
So like, what do you think? Like, is one of them actually better?
I think this is something that you all out there might have to taste. So in general, we can speak in general terms that conical will kind of give more to your body because it produces more fine, so more surface area. It's crushing a lot longer than flat. But if we could actually put this down into how we test things, we're looking at sharpness, size, and alignment.
Right.
So tell me more about that.
So same thing like I just mentioned, like the sharper that a burr is, we're gonna be able to know more be able to predict better like how well that's going to cut. Again, our knife versus the hammer cutting the watermelon in half. Like if we know that burrs are sharper, we're going to know that it's going to cut more and be able to predict that it's going to come into more consistent things. Now that being said, just to keep in mind with just grinders in general, you are going to have a seasoning period with your burrs. So generally it's suggested to run about like a half a pound of coffee through a new set of burrs.
Yeah, just about.
Basically to keep them from being so sharp that it's kind of hard to keep them under control. But after running again like about a half a pound of coffee through is when a grinder should kind of like mature and be into giving you like the most consistent grind that it can, at least for a number of years or a number of thousands of shots until those burrs start to like really wear down. So just be aware of that when you do have a new grinder.
Exactly. So as they are newer and newer, or maybe we're starting off with a higher hardness level, which these SSP burrs, these flat ones, do start off with a higher hardness and keep their sharp edges a lot longer with those flat burrs. With that, they're going to be able to cut into more even distributions, because as soon as these dull down, which you'll find over time, they start to actually create more of a crush than a slice. And as things crush, we can kind of think of this on a very basic level that, beans are brittle, and as they crush, it'll be kind of bursting into random grind sizes, and you'll never be able to dial anything in, at least nothing in as consistent as you'd like, because those particle distributions will be all over the place instead of slicing through there. So another thing that we want to look at besides that sharpness is actually the size as well.
Like obviously there are two different size burrs. Like what's the benefit of the change that we're gonna get between two different size of burrs?
Yeah, definitely. So, larger burrs tend to produce more even grind distributions as well, because we're kind of dispersing a lot of that cutting surface area as well. And this actually produces less friction as well.
Yeah, which means that your burrs are not going to get as hot as quickly, which is important for a couple of different reasons that we're going to touch on related to the volatility and the actual like aroma of our beans. More surface area doing the work of cutting and crushing the coffee, they're not going to get as hot as quickly.
Exactly. So if those don't get as hot and your burrs don't get as hot, that won't actually transfer onto your beans afterwards. And that's where it's important that we don't want too much friction or heat transfer. Because as you heat up your beans, they actually plasticize. And that actually changes that brittleness. So if your beans aren't as brittle, they're not going to break down into anything symmetrical than when you first started. Because at first you're crushing and tearing and slicing into even distributions, and then as it becomes a plastic, you're really relying on cutting, not so much crushing into anything.
Yeah, kind of like something similar to think about. It was like a hard candy almost, like a hard candy like at a normal room temperature. If you chomp into it, it's gonna break apart into 100,000 pieces in your mouth. But you leave it out in the sun for too long, it starts getting squishy and stuff. It might actually start being like chewy as you put it in your mouth. So something kind of think about, like same thing with coffee. Like as it's heating up, it's going to kind of get like stretchy and, like you said, plasticky, as opposed to being brittle and breakable, which is obviously going to change the grind size up.
And it might taste disgusting at that point too. So as you're also heating up, one very volatile thing happens, which is losing aroma. When it comes to coffee, it's really hard to taste a lot of things that are going on here. So we really want to focus on keeping in as much aroma as possible. And as we heat up coffee, a lot of those aroma compounds are then being lost to the grinder. As you walk into a shop and you hear, grinders going like crazy, and it might smell good, but they're, producing a lot of heat. That's actually kind of a bad thing. It's losing most of its essence of coffee at that point already, before we even get to extraction. That's how volatile coffee is. That will lose it in the grinder before we even extract it.
Yeah, because you might think like we're here because we love coffee. Like the smell of ground coffee smells great, but I want to taste that more than I just want to smell it before I'm even brewing my coffee, really. So.
And then one last thing before we move on from burrs, without getting too far into it, maybe you could describe this one.
Yeah, so we want to also be careful of, or just something to be aware of, is the alignment of your burrs. Actually, let me grab these SSP burrs because they're a little bit bigger and a little bit easier to display.
See, even you prefer the larger burrs.
I do. Less friction, Something to be aware of with your burrs is to be conscious or aware of the alignment of them. So basically there's two ways that the alignment of your burrs can be off. Essentially, ideally, the burrs are evenly lined up, evenly spaced, but if they come off axis from each other, either on a sideways kind of axis like this, where having more space for them to come out of one side of the burr than the other when we're grinding our coffee, or you might also see them off axis this way, where one edge is closer than the other. These are very extreme examples. If your grinder is ever in a condition like this, it's probably not actually operating.
Please call me.
So this is something to be aware of, like if you're ever taking apart your grinder, doing a servicing on it, or if you're noticing that you're getting inconsistent grind size on your grinder that had once been very consistent, you might want to crack it open and see if you're misaligned at all. Again, these very drastic examples of either being misaligned this way or being misaligned this way, or hopefully not, but it could also be a combination of both.
Exactly. So this will change your overall extraction and taste over time, because you're either allowing a large exit of larger boulders that don't contribute a lot to that bold extraction, and then you're also producing maybe in some cases fines, and it will change. It actually changes kind of in a cosine sort of rhythm. So you'll be consistently inconsistent.
Consistency is key. Yes.
Before we start getting into some extractions and kind of continuing on how important temperature is, let's go ahead and answer some questions.
Yeah, cool. So Nina is asking if we can talk about tuning the grind size on a Gaggia Magenta Prestige. The thing to notice, obviously right off the bat, is that is a super automatic machine. So we unfortunately don't have a ton of control over the grind size. I think it's 5 different grind settings on the Gaggia Magenta Prestige. But how would we tune in on a super automatic grinder?
So with super autos, I tend to, since you're already starting with a pretty low dose, is actually start off as fine as possible. So when you start off as fine as possible, you're trying to extract as much as possible. Now, if that's too bitter for you, kind of slowly move to a coarser grind, because that is going to be the one thing that you can really change for your overall extraction is that grind size. So that's the main controls that you can really get. On a super auto, it's pretty difficult. Most controls that we'll be talking today are those capable from kind of your flat burrs or conical standalone sort of grinders, is where you can have a lot of control over that overall taste.
Yeah, my initial reaction to that, Nina, is unfortunately I would start on the finest or the second to finest setting and really just run a few shots with it and see which tastes best to you.
Yep. All right, so next question. Chris is asking how noticeable the difference is in taste between 80 millimeter and 65 millimeter burrs. And this is a great question. So it's something that you can kind of test yourself. It depends on the actual geometry of how things are cutting and how things are mashing. So there are burrs out there like these Chiato ones and these SSP burrs. And a lot of people consider this an upgrade due to its hardness level. So since the hardness level and the sharpness is increasing, we can actually have more of a consistent grind distribution in comparison to maybe the stock flat smaller burrs as well. So one noticeable taste difference, if we're not considering too much heat, will actually come dependent on the actual amount of fines being produced. Now, when we think about the fact that these burrs will taste like the distribution that it creates, which is why we start changing geometries. You can create a geometry that creates the same exact grind distribution no matter what size it is. So when we're starting to talk about size of burrs, that mainly has to do with heat and friction. So we know so much about burrs now that we can kind of change those exit velocities and pre-mashing burrs and little things about it that we can really replicate tastes of different kinds of burrs. So there's a lot of studies being done by bigger brands like Malkonig and Chiato, manipulating all of these geometries for those exit velocities to give you very similar tastes, maybe even conical, creating more fines for darker roast. And you'll start seeing them labeled now as like dark roast burrs and light roast burrs. All depends on the geometry, not quite the size. All right, and then let's do one more question here. So Timothy is saying, say you grind a few shots per day, how long would your burrs last? And how frequently should you consider replacing them? is there any way to tell by a visual inspection? This is a great question because I actually have a burr and grinder open over here. So Ben is going to go ahead and zoom in on this. Ben, our amazing director back there, controlling all of our visuals today. So I have one of the Chiato E37S's over here. And as you can see, I did an install of some SSPs on this as an upgrade a while back. And we can see that it's getting pretty dirty here. And there are some visual things that I can look at here. So as they become dirty and gunky up in here, the first thing that you can do is ensure that you're taking apart your burrs and kind of cleaning this off. You can use a brush to kind of brush off things and also notice the sharpness. So sometimes it's just kind of getting to know your burrs and knowing the sharpness, and then also looking at different visual effects. Like you'll be able to see burrs starting to wear down towards the tips of this exit here. And you'll be able to feel that it's completely smooth sometimes. So that's one of the visuals that you can actually see on your burrs if they're really starting to wear down. And if they feel, in general, pretty brittle as well, it might be time to start upgrading those burrs. Now I suggest, pretty frequently cleaning your burrs too, especially if you have dark roast, because those can really gunk up in here. And as you can see, some designs actually have those screw designs mounted inside your burr geometry as well, where those can start collecting a lot of those oils as well and start affecting the taste of your shot as well.
Yeah. So staying up to date with your kind of general maintenance on your grinder and your other equipment is going to play a big part in that, with also just like being familiar with your gear, like kind of like you said, just like feeling it beforehand, like opening your grinder when you first get it, kind of checking out the burrs, what they look like, what they feel like, and then when you go back in a couple months to do your first cleaning or whatever, you might actually notice like a pretty big difference on that. And just kind of being familiar with your gear in that way by doing your regular maintenance and stuff can probably go a long way on that.
You also might have to go finer and finer with your grind size.
Right,
so
yeah.
There's a couple things right there, but I think we're going to go ahead and move on from there. So we talked a little bit about how volatile the aroma compound is just due to heat on your grinder. So we can only imagine at this point what temperature and high temperatures will affect your taste on the espresso during your extraction.
Yeah.
So as soon as water actually leaves your portafilter, your machine itself, that group head, we're already starting to see drops in our water temperature, especially as it hits this cooler mass we call a coffee puck. So as it's dry and it's slowly starting to seep through our dirty puck here, or at this case, it would be an unextracted puck. So as we are here, and we start our extraction, we can imagine our water slowly coming through, a little hard to see, slowly coming through our puck. So this is called the permeability of our shot. So without going too much into permeability, that is just dependent on the flow of how we're actually passing liquid through this puck. It depends on a lot of other things like flow rate and restrictions, and CO2. There's a bunch going on when it comes to extraction. But as we're extracting our coffee, we're also seeing a temperature fluctuation just in our coffee puck alone. So on the top of our extraction, so at the top of our puck, we'll actually see a higher temperature than the bottom. Now, why this matters is that certain compounds are going to be released at higher temperatures, and they won't be released at lower temperatures. So we might see fluctuations in taste alone dependent on how that water is passing through our puck. So this also depends on the time it's also passing through that puck too. So if we could somehow slow that down, maybe we'll have more consistent temperatures to better enable all of those flavor compounds to be evenly extracted, aka kind of that flow rate, paying attention to your overall flow rate. So top extracts a lot faster than your bottom. So not only are temperatures changing your extractions, we also mentioned those compounds are also being extracted differently. So there are compounds that are more soluble at high temperatures than low temperatures. So we're changing the overall flavor profile depending on what temperature we're starting at. So if we start at a high temperature, which Zach is actually showing right now, we're actually extracting certain compounds that are released during a high extraction.
Yeah.
So right here, we're pulling at a 202, I believe.
Yeah, or 203, I have it set at. Yep.
203.
Yeah, so we're looking for our dosage out, and I got to our 35, 36 grams on our dosage of 17.5 grams. So our yield out on this, we got to our 35, 36 seconds in about, 36 grams in about 20-ish seconds
Gotcha.
on the pull there.
So we're going to keep that in mind for later because we're also going to be testing this as we go.
Yep.
All right, so we talked about how water is changing as soon as it leaves that portafilter. It's changing as we extract.
Yeah.
Now, it might be extracting different compounds as we go by, but it's not changing our overall TDS, which is a really confusing thing that not a lot of people kind of understand. It's a little hard to grasp.
Yeah, and it kind of took me a second to like get how that made sense at first. But basically, the temperature is not going to change how much coffee is going to be in our coffee. But at the end of what it is going to change is basically the flavors that we're getting out of it because we're extracting different acids or different compounds, right?
Exactly. So with higher temperatures, we're actually extracting those less volatile compounds. So that also can create a lot of balance from that as well. So although it's not changing our overall extraction, where you might think of that as like over extraction and bitter, we're also extracting different compounds. These compounds that we extract at these high temperatures, the two main ones are actually furin, which contribute a lot to spicy notes and might become a little bit smoky. Then we also have pyridines. So these pyridines are also bitterness and astringency that can come off during the extraction of these high temp extraction, so maybe towards the tip of that shot. So this typically happens due to a slow flow rate, which kind of naturally happens at high temperatures. So at high temperatures, we see a lower flow rate due to gases being less soluble during that process. So since gases, which CO2 is a natural gas inside our bean that's kind of released during that extraction, if we can't get to that, then it actually forms bubbles within our puck. And with those bubbles, it creates even more resistance. So I know that's a little chemistry experiment. It's a little hard to describe, but in general, you have to kind of think about it that if we're at a higher temperature, we might see a slower flow.
Right.
So to kind of sum things up. So when we're talking about flow, I guess we should probably talk about maybe a low temperature extraction. So when it comes to flow, I guess you can kind of think about it counterintuitively. So if we have then a low temperature, and now we can actually extract those gases, that it's not creating so much of a turbulent flow, you might see a faster flow with that initially as well.
Right. Because on the hot end, we're basically creating gas by it being so hot, but not doing so much of that by being at a lower temperature. We're actually going to be able to move past the coffee a little bit quicker by doing that.
So from that temp, we can kind of understand why flow kind of matters. Now, on the other hand, your actual extraction and your particle size also can contribute to this, but we can really control this as well due to one more thing, this thing right on top here.
Yep. Being our flow control device, if you don't have a machine with this available on it, you can still kind of manipulate things like your pre-infusion and stuff like that. But this flow control device essentially on here is directly allowing different amounts of water passing through our group head and into our puck. So this is a direct restrictor for that, which is available on a lot of like the E61 style machines that you'll commonly find on ECM, Profitec, Rocket, you know, the higher end brands like that. Will have a flow control option available.
So at lower temperatures, we might find more desirable compounds that kind of taste like sweetness. Lots of good stuff within that lower temperature, maybe around 200 or so, towards the bottom of that puck even. So we can manipulate our temperature, but then if our flow is too fast, we can also manipulate that flow. Because more desirable compounds are actually noticed at that lower flow rate as well. Not only due to that temperature, but at that lower flow. And that has to kind of do a lot to do with the ability to keep a similar temperature throughout that extraction.
Right, yeah.
We're getting really technical today, so if there's any questions, please feel free to keep throwing those inside the comments, because it does turn into a little bit of a chemistry experiment as we're kind of describing. Yeah. So Zach's actually pulling a couple different shots here to kind of show that difference in resistance as well that we get from just, all we did was just change our temperature and we had a little bit of a different shot.
Yeah, we did. So there was a little bit of channeling on the shot. I didn't take as much time as preparing it as I would if I was making something to enjoy for like an actually enjoyable drink. But I'm still using like a Bravo distributor and a pressure regulated tamper. So ideally, like the rest of our variables in our puck preparation are the same. Regulating our pressure that we're using when tamping, our weight-based grinders regulating our dose amount to be a consistent amount, and then we were looking for the same amount for our yield coming out. And the shot was a little quick, like this grinder needs to be dialed in a little bit, probably to get more in the ballpark of where we would want our creme wave coffee to be dialed in at, but I did still notice that shot ran about 3 or 4 seconds faster to the same. We had just over 36 grams out again, so just directly you can see a 6-degree difference.
On just temperature.
Right, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, changed our shot extraction time by, what is it, roughly 15% or something like that, so.
So as we see that change in temperature, we can also think about pressure as well. So if it's moving faster, it's permeating faster through this, then that's also going to change what's happening to that erosion effect that we're thinking of within our puck. So as it's eroding away, it's actually becoming more turbulent in this fact as well. We want a nice even flow throughout. So if we're finding that correct temperature, and in this case it's getting too turbulent as we're cooling down, maybe we don't want that, because a couple bad things happen, and you saw one of them. Right. Channeling started occurring because of that high pressure that was created due to that turbulence. And then our viscosity will also change as well. So viscosity, we have this debate always going back and forth of what high viscosity and low viscosity really means. It really gets kind of confusing, but viscosity is basically that thickness of your liquid. And we've all seen this at home too, that your initial shot is actually going to be very viscous. Very viscous.
Yes, very viscous.
It's
and
very
thick is
very
our definition
thick.
of viscous.
It's kind of like a lava coming out at first. So most of your solubles coming from those fines happens pretty immediately during that process. It's very immediately soluble, and then as things erode away, because we're kind of washing off the surfaces, we're also allowing for that higher pressure to flow through. So we might need to change that, right? Because as it's eroding away, we start getting a whole bunch of channeling.
Yep.
And then another bad thing happens where your fines actually start migrating through those channels, and then they get to the bottom of your portafilter, and they might clog your portafilter with those small little grind sizes. That's called fines migration, as it migrates to the bottom. And so many bad things can happen from that.
Yeah.
Everything we're doing is causing channeling. It's horrible.
Yeah, so basically, like as we're brewing our coffee, we're intentionally breaking it down, but it does cause, spaces to be formed. Again, with espresso specifically, it's under a lot of pressure, so as things are breaking down, they're moving around, those fines are going to start finding their way to the bottom of the portafilter basket. You might notice that like the flow rate of your shot like naturally kind of slows down at the end as it kind of gets choked up with those fines migrating and collecting towards the bottom of it. But something that we can do to help with that is going to be related to our flow control and then pre-infusion.
Yes,
So
definitely.
you'll hear pre-infusion as a pretty common term when it gets into more like in-depth brewing and stuff like that. But basically our pre-infusion is like a pre-wetting or a preheating of the coffee before we fully introduce like full 9 or 10 bars of pressure that your machine is supposed to get to, and our full flow rate of the water going through it. Kind of just like get everything heated and wetted evenly before we go full on to our extraction.
Exactly. So if we think about this chemically, we're trapping all of those compounds at a similar temperature, enabling them to be extracted pretty similarly throughout, utilizing the full grind size distribution and all these well-rounded flavors that we can actually get from that. So we actually have a graph that we can bring up while Zach starts preparing a flow profiling shot. So as you've seen so far today, we're actually on this red line. So this is kind of our standard extraction where, you know, our bars of pressure slowly start increasing to our stock bar pressure, which is typically around that 9 bar. At 9 bar, we won't find too much turbidity, where it's going to start breaking apart our puck due to that pressure, and we find a nice even extraction that we can actually get on that 9 bar. Now, if you have different compounds that you're trying to gravitate towards, and you can't seem to, you know, create enough resistance due to that grind size, or something that is just too bitter by going too fine, we can start utilizing a flow profiling chart. So if we want like a super dense light roast that's pretty difficult to extract, we can also utilize this without going too fine with that grind size. So we can get a lot of those sweetness notes that we can get and compounds from a little bit of a coarser grind. So we'll start by pre-saturating, by slowly increasing our pressure, maybe starting around like a 3 bar hesitation, I like to say. Now you can start at this 3 bar until you start getting your first drip. Sometimes this takes anywhere between 3 and 8 seconds. That's a great way to begin your pre-infusion journey, is waiting until that first initial drip, and then we'll start increasing our flow. So increasing our extraction. So as we increase and get to the tip of our extraction, we'll see all those solubles starting to be extracted right at the tip of that shot. And now quickly, our shot's basically extracted at that point due to all those fines being attributed to 50% of our actual extraction, and those are immediately soluble. So that's all going to be right at the beginning. So now we have this viscous liquid going through this eroded puck, so we can actually decrease our pressure, so we stop eroding it. We stop throwing so much pressure on this eroding dirt. I hate to call it dirt, but you can kind of think of it the same sort of way. So we can start decreasing what we call a ramp down period in order for us to create a pretty average flow rate throughout. So this is kind of what we're going to be going for right now. Now that we understand what pre-infusion and this ramp down, and as our coffee is eroding away, we're going to utilize flow control to get the best shot, right?
Yeah, so if your machine doesn't have a flow control device on it, like we do, again, available with most E61 group head machines like we have here on the drive, your machine might have a programmable pre-infusion either way. Like for example, what we have been brewing here with the drive actually does have this active where it's going to automatically have this program to do a 1 second pre-infusion and then a 4 second wait period, and then it goes into full brewing. So you can actually see, Ben, if you want to give us a nice shot on the front of our machine here, so we can see as soon as I lift the brew lever here, it's going to give us 1 second of flow and then a pause.
And this is what's called a hard pre-infusion, where we're actually utilizing that full pressure to saturate our puck.
Right.
Now we can kind of think about a hard pre-infusion. It kind of sounds as like it is. So it is pretty useful for some coffees if we want to quickly get into some of those more or less volatile compounds, because we're quickly saturating with a high temp. But we can also erode it away. So sometimes a soft pre-infusion could be a little bit better, which we can actually do with this top side.
Right.
So you can actually utilize both methods depending on what you're trying to pull. Now, how would you know what compounds are being released when? I'm not a chemist. We'll try both. Right. You know, try both. One might be a little bit more bitter and astringent, and one might be a little bit sweeter. That's how you can really test to see what your coffee specifically is going to release during this hard or soft.
And I'm sure we're going to end on this note at the end, but this is just a reminder to just try a bunch of coffee. Just take an afternoon to just play around with stuff, basically. So if you don't have programmable pre-infusion or a flow control device on your machine, you do always have the option to just manually basically turn your brew switch or your brew lever on and off on your machine. So I could just basically let it go for a second, give it a few seconds to wet, and then go back to a full flow again. If you're using a machine like we have the Gotcha Classic Pro on the end by Zach over there, or a machine that doesn't have a flow control device or a programmable pre-infusion, basically just hit the brew switch, turn it off, after a second or so, let it sit for a few seconds, and kind of experiment with that period of the actual time with the water on, as well as waiting afterwards before turning it back on. Just experiment with it.
Yeah, it's all an experiment.
See what you get, and this could change on the type of coffee that you're using, how they roasted it on that given day.
All right, so I think I'm going to go ahead and do an example of this pre-infusion to a ramp down utilizing our flow control on an E61. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to get everything pretty prepped here. I'm going to go ahead and get to my seconds, and I'm gently putting on my portafilter. I actually start with my flow control all the way off. Now this is going to do a hard pre-infusion to start with, so I'm going to just disregard this first pre-infusion period while that's turned on.
Oh, I did turn the pre-infusion off.
Oh,
on the
okay,
machine,
cool,
actually,
awesome.
yeah.
So I will then go ahead and slowly
I did
ramp
set
up.
our temperature back to 200 and our pre-infusion.
As we have most of our extraction now, I can actually slowly start ramping down. And it looks like this was going pretty fast as well.
Our grinder does need to be dialed in a little bit, so we'll probably adjust this and maybe run another one and see what we get. But
all right, so that was an example of not too much resistance. So we would actually change our grind size to create a little more resistance, especially when it comes to actually controlling this pre-infusion to ramp down. You kind of want that time. So don't get too restricted with time and look at your actual flow time between that 20 and 30 seconds instead of your overall time on heat between that 20 and 30 seconds that we mentioned on the last seminar. So with that, let's go ahead and look into some more questions while we're preparing another puck so we can actually show you a good pre-infusion to a ramp down. So Doctor, I believe, or DR, asks, how to figure out the grind size for different types of espresso and then timing of the grind. So how I typically figure out what kind of grind size that I want, especially after I start getting to know my grinder, I like to stay on a little bit of a coarser side. And the reason I like to stay on the coarser side is that I find a lot of coffees that are immediately soluble from those fines can also become immediately bitter. So if there's no way around that and I don't really have flow control, that's when you can create that resistance using a finer grind accordingly. But if we're talking about pre-infusions and I can start getting into a lot similar temperatures by utilizing pre-infusion, I like to do that with a lot lighter roasts as well. A lot of compounds are going to be released at those higher temperatures with lighter roasts. So that's kind of one of my go-tos. And then coffees that are more immediately soluble, especially very brittle dark roasts, I tend to go also on a little bit of a coarser side and maybe change that temperature due to those furon compounds that are being immediately released. So I like to drop down my temperature. And again, keep that as coarse as possible so we're not immediately soluble and immediately going into those bitter components. Now, this is kind of a guessing game. So I would say try everything. Maybe try it at a low temperature and a high temperature if you're especially restricted within a certain grind size as well. So you'll find a lot of that within your grind size, your ability through that. So it looks like we have another question.
Looks like Rich is asking, he's using our Crema Wave coffee, 17 grams of coffee in, getting 34 grams out, pulling in about 27 seconds after the extraction starts. Any improvements that you could recommend?
Gotcha. So we're paying attention to the numbers there, and those numbers can be very good. Now this really depends on temperature. So maybe start temperature surfing at this point, because temperature equals flavor at this point of what we've seen. So your flow might overall change according to this, but I would say, let's start messing around with that temperature. If you do include maybe a pre-infusion, you might find an increase in like your texture, which I typically like to do with our Crema Wave. So I would say improve from there. Temperature, not so much on your fine tuning of fine or coarse, if you're okay with that. Maybe going a little bit coarse, and you could get a little bit of a sweeter cup if you tend to go more towards like that 24 second with the Crema Wave.
Yeah, there's gonna be my initial reaction to that, Rich, is gonna be like, okay, we got the numbers where we want it. How does it taste to you, and how would you like your coffee to taste? Like, have you ever had maybe one of your extractions taste a little bit better than another? Like, what were the flavors of that stood out to you as being more desirable? And then kind of looking at the things that we're talking about today and how you can kind of get to what tastes better, because your time is where you want it to be as kind of a benchmark, but really, again, taste it, see how you want it to taste from there, and adjust accordingly. Yeah, like I said, play around with the temperature and even going to a slightly shorter shot to see like if you enjoy it anymore from there.
Yeah, utilize time as a tool, but not as a restriction. So, all right. Do we have any more questions after that?
So we have one from Christopher. He's asking, so if you're using a dark roast coffee, pulling at 200 degrees, 18 grams in, should I be trying to get 27 or 36 out in 25 to 30 seconds? Will it give me more flavor without the bitterness?
Gotcha. So here we kind of need to talk a little bit about our ratios, which we discussed in our first seminar. It was kind of the predecessor of this one. So with that, we're kind of sticking to a normale range when we're first dialing in coffees. I like to stick to that 1 to 2 ratio. Yeah. So the amount of grams inside my portafilter, I want to double out. Now we can kind of think of that when we actually shorten our yield out. We also are just tasting the tip of those shots, so those immediately soluble compounds that we might taste as very astringent as well. So in order to create that well-rounded body, we kind of want to add some of that body of the wooden pulp that's also extracted towards the tip of the shot. So that's why we don't stop it as soon as your water becomes a little bit more towards that, or your espresso becomes more towards that golden color than that rich, dark, deep brown, because we want some of that body alongside of it. We're gonna be able to better perceive it then as well with a little bit more water. So it's hard to say how we want to dial in from there, but again, kind of taste everything. Do everything, taste everything. But if we do wanna put kind of numbers on what we're doing today, and let's say you are struggling at home and you don't know what's wrong. Well, keeping track of those numbers is going to be very important due to our coffee algebra. So a little bit about coffee algebra. I believe we have one slide for this. So if y'all at home do somehow have a TDS at home, you can kind of follow along from here. So as we're working in coffee shops or trying to dial in different coffees, we kind of like to put some numbers to test and keep track of coffees that we like. It's like, oh man, I really like that extraction. What exactly was that extraction? Well, there's a number to it. So utilizing our TDS, where it's shining that light and basically figuring out that coffee to water ratio, we can actually come up with a yield extraction, or extraction yield, depending on our other two variables that we're controlling. So that would be our dose and our yield out. So how much coffee we're using comparison to how much liquid espresso we're getting out. And this is where it kind of matters, because within that, we're wanting to stick between about an 18 to 22% extraction. So extraction yield. Not to be confused between a TDS, because the TDS, we want to stick right around an 8 to 12% when testing. So that's kind of the golden window of what we're looking at. That kind of incorporates a lot of our soluble compounds that attribute a lot to sweetness and the bulk of that coffee, because overall, we can extract 33% of our bean, but do we want it? No, it'll be horrible. It'll taste like wood. So let's not do that. So in order to do so, let's go ahead and start tasting some of these things.
Yeah. So let's.
Maybe not tasting, but extract. Or,
yeah, we're gonna run our pre-infusion and ramp down shot one more time here, see if we get any better results out of that. But kind of what you're just discussing is really like more in depth. Again, algebra, like straight up math that might be looked at more on a commercial side of coffee brewing, like something that you'll see in a high-end shop. They might be looking at TDS readings, or when a roaster is preparing a coffee, right?
Here in our lab.
Yeah.
All right.
So we're shots running a little bit smoother now, coming out a little, definitely cleaner.
Whoop. And as you can see, we can actually stick to a similar flow rate by even changing the pressure in, because most of our coffee has now been eroded away. Yeah. And a lot of those compounds that attribute to sweetness can actually come from this lower flow. So oftentimes I'll actually utilize that towards the tip of my shot and actually ramp all the way down at a certain point where, at the beginning of that flow, man, 2 grams per second, that would never actually flow through at 2 bar because we have so much restriction. Yeah. But now that we're evenly flowing through, and we could actually ramp down a little bit.
Right.
So now that it's eroded away. All right. So
we
what do we got here?
Our high temperature shot at about 203, our low temperature shot, which pulled about 197. Again, both these shots pulled a little bit quickly, so they're probably not exactly where we want them to be anyway. But then this was our last shot where we did the pre-infusion and the manual ramp down of our flow throughout the shot preparation. So
perfect. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and test these. We always test at more of a cool temperature, just because the particles within our coffee are actually gonna be a lot more excited and bouncing around while it's hot. And we can also perceive sweetness and these flavor compounds due to that same sort of thing. It's really hard to perceive these things that are really hot in comparison to really cool. Well, we're kind of thinking of the TDS in the same sort of way. So I'm gonna go ahead, and now that these are cooled, I'm gonna go ahead and take a little bit of a sample, and we'll go ahead and take a TDS, and I'll get out my handy dandy calculator and see what we got going on over here. All right, so just have a small spoonful here. Turn on my dye fluid, and I'll drop my coffee in here.
Nice close-up shot of our reading here. Let's see what we get out of there.
All right, so we'll go ahead and read this. Also shows you that temperature, just in case you haven't cooled down. And as we were talking about previously, we wanted to be between 8 and 12%. Yeah. So this is well within. So we can now calculate, okay, what did we get in and out, and put that into our equation as well.
Yeah, but I'm immediately noticing with that, again, this was the higher temperature shot where we discussed that we're gonna get a little bit less of our, not necessarily less of our solubles out of it, but we're gonna get a lower concentration, or not, with the higher temperature shot.
Yeah, we're just looking at flavor. So all of these readings should be pretty similar, except for our yields out were a little bit different. So if we were more similar on that, we would probably have a little bit similar reading. So we'll kind of see what the differences were, just because our yields were changing a little bit. So do we recall what it was that we were, what we got? Because what we need to do in order to get our extraction yield, as per our coffee algebra earlier, we actually need our TDS.
Our yield out on our first shot was about 35.5 grams.
35.
The second one was closer to 36 grams. It's going to be a little bit off, but yeah, the first one was about 35.5. Second one was about 36 grams.
35 times. Oh, I guess I could stay inside of a.
So
Got it.
Go ahead and drop it there.
Trying to show you all math with my pretty pink calculator here. So we can actually take what is our actual TDS, so our total dissolved solids, multiplied by our beverage weight. So with that first one, it was about 35.5 or so, and we're actually going to divide that number by what would be our dose. And dose each time was about 17.5 grams. So our extraction yield on that first one was actually 17.36%. So we're actually under extracted according to our numbers. So although we had a high temp on that, it didn't matter on our extraction. It didn't matter whatsoever on our extraction, but it would probably taste bitter. So it's under extracted, but we also get into those bitter compounds.
And we probably could have expected that as well, knowing that it was under extracted, because the shot did run so fast. Again, we got our 36 grams out in about 20 seconds, whereas we would normally be expecting, like I think it was Chris or one of the other questions that I asked, around 27 seconds, kind of be in the ballpark of a good extraction. So we probably could have expected that, just knowing that our grind size was a bit too coarse for that shot to begin with.
But our temperature didn't do that.
Yes. So if we do our TDS reading on the shot that we pulled immediately after that at 197 degrees, we are ideally seeing about the same TDS rating of, was about 8% that we had on the first one?
Yep, so 8.56.
Yep, cool. So let's see what we got.
Traditionally in a lab too, we'll be doing this a couple times with the same sort of sample, just because you might find different bulks of solids within your actual cup itself. So let's go ahead and test this one now. And this was going to be the lower temp.
Cool. Yep, so that was at 197 that we pulled this one at. Can we get a temperature of...
All right, so we have a
degrees?
7.99 on this one. So our TDS actually did change, but we also changed our yield slightly.
Yeah, it did change slightly, but that's still like within what, a 0.5%. It's not like it does kind of get blown up in espresso. It's not a huge change, but we're still pretty well in the same realm of what we were looking at on the
exactly.
first TDS
So
reading.
overall, you can say those total resolved solids did not really change between those two temperatures, although they were very drastic and they will taste very different.
Yeah.
You know, our TDS really just kind of stayed the same.
Yes.
So even if we take that, our first number, multiplied by 36, divided by 17. I can math. We got this. I went to school for this. So we got an even lower extraction, but you know, off by maybe 1%. So our temperature overall is not really changing too much on our actual extraction, but so much on taste.
Right. So why don't we split up these two shots, the 203 and the 197 temperature shots, and we will just try them and see like what we're tasting as a difference on them as a result of that.
All right. So these flavor compounds will now be a little bit more a little bit more noticeable.
So is this my cool one or my hot one?
So this one's going to be the cool one.
Okay, so that's our 197, and let me get some of that 203 shot. Cool.
All right, so let's go ahead and try 203. Very bitter, very strong.
Yes. Yeah, noticing right off the bat, getting a lot of that bitterness and kind of like ashiness in it.
Although it even says that we're under extracted.
Right.
So it doesn't actually matter.
Yeah, I can tell that it does have like a watery kind of back taste to it. It doesn't feel as full as I would really like a shot to be, but still getting those bitter flavors out of it, which is interesting.
So I immediately get more of the sour notes off of this next one. So this lower temperature shot. It actually feels pretty well rounded. I start getting into a lot of the chocolate, so maybe I actually do like a lot of the solubles that are within this lower temperature. So I might need to push my extraction a little bit further so I can get more into that, but this one is easier to drink in a way. Technically a little bit more towards the sour, but definitely easier than the bitter.
Yeah, kind of more spicy feeling, even with those sour notes
Lots
in
of
it.
Furon on that.
Yeah, so really interesting. Like we you know, in the grand scheme of things, you don't think 6 degrees changes a lot, but with espresso, everything is so blown up because being under different pressures and different temperatures, like very minor changes are making a huge difference in what you're actually tasting at the end of the day.
But overall, the numbers show exactly alike. So that's why we always tell everyone, taste everything. You know, mess around with some temperatures. You know, sticking with that yield in and out. Yes, it's a great thing to kind of go through to stay consistent, but you can also escape from that because things are definitely more according to taste than by the numbers. So definitely keep that in mind throughout your espresso journey.
Yes.
And then utilize all the tools and knowledge that we're teaching you as we rant.
My last test for science, I actually mixed these two together and like...
Oh, perfect. A little bit of body from both. So maybe we can actually find something from this.
Not perfect, but definitely more agreeable than both of them on their own. So I would definitely suggest brewing the creme wave specifically around, probably on like the 199, 200 side.
Yep.
But yeah, definitely interesting that mixing them together, even though they pulled at different times, different temperatures and stuff. Very agreeable and like more balance between the two of them.
Yeah,
So,
and
anyway.
those compounds will be a difference of a degree or so, which is pretty crazy. So, especially with that immediate permeability. All right, so let's go ahead and get into some questions now that we can hardly talk with this coating.
We're running a little bit over time, but we'll take a few minutes to ask more questions. So feel free to throw any last minute questions in there. Again, feel free to call or email us or use our chat function. ourselves or one of the other great people on our team will be able to talk to you later for more help. Looks like Adam is asking if you're using a dark roast, should be using a higher level of bar. I'm assuming like a higher pressure for brewing.
Yeah, so with darker roast, I actually prefer, I can go either way. It really depends. So I like to get that full extraction and go coarse as possible. So that, you kind of have to lower your pressure in order to do so, because I don't want too much surface area in there. It's already very brittle, so it's going to break apart into immediate solubles. So go as coarse as possible, and then you actually have to lower your pressure. Now, if you don't have too much control or anything like that, you might be forced into a pretty fine grind, and then you have to be forced into a higher pressure, and then maybe you're changing your yield out too. So those things will kind of change some things, or temperature. Temperature will be more key towards flavor. So.
Nina, I believe, asked a question before. She's back again asking, back again asking, what effect does decaf beans have on all of this? Which, to me, is a very interesting question. As a primarily decaf drinker, I've also been trying to get more into the science and really fine tuning in on decaf coffees, especially. And this could also depend on the process that's used for decaffeinating the coffees, being between a chemical or a washed decaffeinating process. But how is that the basics of how a decaf coffee is going to react differently to these changes in tuning in?
Yeah, so different compounds are then attributed to different coffees dependent on how they are actually processed. So fermented ones will actually attribute a lot to different kinds of carbs that are now involved, and actually attribute a lot to different sweetness sort of compounds that are in there. And same with decaf. There's different chemical processes that are actually releasing different compounds at different times of a decaf coffee. Let alone, it's also a little bit more brittle. Some cases can be a little more plasticized as is, due to already being kind of washed out and deformed from that decaffeination, like a Swiss water process. It is kind of on that plastic side, so you might have a lot of boulders. Really hard to get very consistent extractions without going super fine with that grind. So messing around with those temperatures and finding those different volatile compounds and really surfing on a decaf is going to be the most important thing you ever do with a decaf coffee.
Yeah, definitely experiment with your temperature, first and foremost, once you get your basic dial-in done. Unfortunate part of being a decaf drinker, again, I understand the pain, unfortunately. Kind of lose out on some of the more subtle nuances and more exciting flavors that you're liable to get out of an unwashed or an unprocessed coffee. Yeah, definitely first try changing up your temperature and kind of seeing where it pulls you, depending on the specific coffee that you're using.
Because there's very volatile compounds at that too within decaf, so really pay attention to that.
Yeah.
So maybe lower temperatures for decaf.
Yep.
All right.
So another question asking, using a vibration device when prepping the coffee in the basket by definition makes the fine move to the bottom and the larger particles move to the top. Is that a bad thing?
If you can do a pre-infusion, no. So fines migration, this is kind of enabling that fines migration to really happen, unfortunately, which can cause a lot of jamming. So jamming or stalling can occur. And if you do see that visually happen, is when I would suggest introducing a little bit more of a pre-infusion on that extraction.
Yeah.
But you also have to think that it's a little bit more soluble on the top than the bottom. So as we get to those fines, if we're starting at a lower temperature, we'll have a really low temperature by the time we get to those fines. So it's a fun experiment to actually use those vibrational distribution techniques, just utilizing the fact that temperature is changing and fluctuating within that basket. So it's not going to be as soluble at that lower temperature by the time you get to that bottom. So pre-infusing with a lower temperature and you'll be fine.
Yeah, I know there's like a lot of discussion around tools like accessories. I know it's kind of hard to show this wearing a black shirt, but for example, we have the WD-2 whisking tool here, which helps with your particle distribution when you're preparing your puck. Might be looking at things like a blind shaker and stuff like that, like different tools and knickknacks and accessories. There's a lot of discussion about these things, again, that you'll see online, YouTube videos and stuff like that. Yeah, just an example of one of the tools that they're kind of referring to with the vibrational techniques.
Yeah, and then just kind of as our last tips and tricks too, before you kind of go home and mess with temperature surfing with different coffees and all that fun stuff, really pay attention to your water, because after all, when it comes to espresso, it's about 92% of what you're drinking. And how we're actually going to perceive all those compounds, since these are really hard to taste, is that we actually have to kind of flavor that coffee in order for it to come out, kind of like flavoring a steak with salt.
Right.
You know, we can actually really taste that steak afterwards. We use the same thing with different minerals attributed to our water, but we're picky about them. And if you want to learn more about those minerals, I would highly suggest coming to my lecture tomorrow, my seminar, where I'm going to teach you more about those minerals, which ones we need to look at, which ones are attributing to flavor, which ones are going to scale up our machine, and we're going to start messing around with all the, alkalinity and total dissolves, and it's going to be a fun one. It's going to be great.
If the chemistry side of things is kind of appealing to you, or you have a good grasp on those things, like tomorrow's talk will definitely be great. You'll be here with Brian Tucker, one of our technical leads.
Yep.
Yeah, super knowledgeable, really in depth on how water is going to change things. So important to keep in mind both for like the longevity and the like maintenance and care of your machine, but also the taste that you're getting out of it as well. So that's definitely going to be, it's an interesting and a whole other rabbit hole to jump into.
That we're forever learning more and more about it, but we'll give you what we know about it as of today. So
cool.
With that, thank you so much for joining us. I know we went a little over time, so thanks for hanging in there with us too. So feel free to check out our seminar schedule on our website for more information, including that water one that we have coming up tomorrow. My name is Zach.
I am also Zach.
That's right, back to back, Zach to Zach. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for being here, guys. See ya.